and welcome to the studio at African Utility Week and PowerGen Africa. Today I'm speaking to Terje Osmundsen around policies needed to drive the sustainable energy future. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Terje, what are the challenges around changing the course of this energy landscape, transitioning from fossil fuels to renewables?
Now, you have to look at it in the context and remember that Africa, the whole of Africa has less installed capacity of power generation than one country in Europe, which is France, whereas Africa has soon 1 billion people. So then you need to take it, so that is an illustration that Africa first of all need to develop very much more power generation capacity in the years to come to meet the development need. The big risk is that this will be done the same way that Europe and the United States and the rest of the world has done, whereas the challenge for Africa is that they need to do it in a sustainable path, but the opportunities are there. And most importantly, I think what we see now is that the combination of the falling cost of renewables, the radical drop in cost of renewables, and the whole changing financial environment, which makes it more and more difficult to finance, for instance, coal power plants. All this makes a great opportunity now to open up a vast investment boom in renewables, in particular distributed renewables in Africa.
So what are some of the policy changes that are needed to facilitate this transition to a more sustainable energy future?
Well, I think first of all, we have to make sure that we get transparency as to the cost, because very often we see that the cost of you could say fossil fuel generation by oil-fired power plants or coal-fired power plants or diesel generation gensets, very often those costs are hidden because the fuel is subsidized or capital is subsidized. So when renewables have to compete with subsidized fossil fuels, it's very difficult. So most of Africa, over Africa today, we see a trend towards reducing those subsidies, which is very important. Secondly, what we need to do, of course, is to enable up for competition in this area, so that entrepreneurs. The last year I've been participating at least 4 or 5 events like this in the various places in Africa, and what strikes me is to see the number of young entrepreneurs in Africa who wants to do business innovation in the area of renewables. And we must make space open for those people to compete with conventional energy, because they are competitive, but they need a space. That means that they must be allowed to set up small power plant to sell into their communities, to commercial industrial plant, and demonstrate what is the possibility. If you look at, for instance, a country like Germany or most of Europe, you see that the decentralized renewables connected to the grid locally have been the driving force of the green revolution, and this is what now must come to Africa.
What is your vision for the future of Africa in the next 5 to 10 years?
Now, what I see is that Africa actually has the opportunity to learn or to actually to do things that innovate in many areas. To take one example, of course, is what we see now in the area of mini grids, right? So I think that the combination of digitization and the development of new payment technologies and new, you could say, renewable and storage concepts for mini grids is going to, I think, fuel a kind of a decentralized energy revolution, which we haven't seen in the United States and Europe. And that, of course, will open up for new businesses that have new experience in terms of payment, in terms of monitoring, in terms of sharing, maybe even blockchain technology in the application of energy. Because when you start from the bottom, in a way, as Africa has a chance to do, you can actually do things differently and much more smarter than if you start from the top, which has been the tradition so far.
Of course, Africa has that possibility to leapfrog all the developmental stages that developed countries have gone through.
Yeah, clearly that we see that already, that the innovation now in that part of the energy chain is taking place more in developing countries than in developed countries. Another point, of course, is that Africa must now tap into this huge flow of climate finance and impact finance money which is available, and that money is looking for good ways to reduce poverty, to reduce carbon emissions, to create jobs. And I think that if African economies are opening up for such kind of investments, they were going to see that there's going to be much more capital being available for those investments than currently is the situation.
What are some of the key takeaways you've seen from African Utility Week and PowerGen Africa?
Well, first of all, I see that what is interesting now is that we see clearly that many of the players who have been, as you could see, strong in the conventional energy sector are moving into renewable. I see that renewables now becoming mainstream also in Africa. It's not only challengers, but it's becoming mainstream by many of the existing players. A second thing which I think is an important trend I see here is that there is a lot of focus on how to share experiences of running these mini grids. There's a big challenge for many African countries, but there is a lot to learn from the best practice, and we see that the mini grid operators that has been able to combine electricity with other services, combining with using the energy supply and energy structure to actually also improve communities, offer other services, those are the most successful. And then finally, I think what I noted from this morning's keynote session was that even South Africa's energy minister himself was very open in his, and I would say surprisingly candid in his recognition that although South Africa has a lot of coal resources, like many other African countries, the banks, even both the private banks and all the government, are no longer interested in financing those projects. So what we see now is that African leaders are experiencing that the financial markets, not only government policies, are actually pushing towards a more sustainable development.
Thank you, that's very interesting. Be sure to subscribe to our channel for more industry-related content. Thanks for joining us.